Hello, everyone. Welcome to Worlds Between Words. Today we're going to be studying Dracula. I'm Aisha, and this is Deco, and we'll be your lecturers for this session.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. That's right. Today we're going to be talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula, a novel that I really, really like. And I've told Aisha this is my favorite novel before. She doubts me because, as I said in the last episode, I have so many favorite novels. The moment I read a good one, I just turn to that one, and then it becomes the new favorite novel. But this really is a good novel. Um, there are so many things that we're going to try and pick from the novel today. But I think I'm going to turn it back to Aisha and let Aisha tell us a little bit about Bram Stoker, the author, and just a little bit about the text itself, time of publication, and so on, for us to get a better feel on the context of this particular novel. So Aisha, all yours.
Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897. This is about 70 years after Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And both of them are those sci-fi literary masterpieces that are still that define how we view monsters in general in this day and age. Like what we know of vampires, we mainly take from Dracula. And what Stoker decided to do with this character. It's like, it wasn't new. It wasn't the first time a vampire was in literature. However, it is what we now look at as being this is how vampires are. So, the whole garlic thing, the killing them by beheading them after they're dead, the driving a stake through their heart, all these things, the things that are stereotypically vampiric, we get mainly from Dracula. I mean, the decrepit coffin sleeping thing, that's definitely more Nosferatu. But this is a lot more, the typical things are a lot more from Bram Stoker's Dracula. Bram Stoker was an Irish author. He grew up because he grew up in Ireland, he has more of a sense of, I think you could see it from his writing, a sense of description of landscape and descriptions and that kind of thing. He grew up during the Victorian period, so which plays a large part in why Dracula is definitely a Gothic novel. The gloom, the darkness, but also the science. So there was a huge from Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein onward, there was a huge influx, if you would, of science combating just plain mythology, or in some ways marrying well with just plain mythology. Dracula the book is an epistolary text. And it was, according to Stoker himself, heavily influenced by his trip to Whitby in the 1870s. Yeah, he graduated from Trinity College Dublin. He was friends with Oscar Wilde at one point. Bro had an interesting life. But he died of locomotor ataxia, which is, they think that he had locomotor ataxia, which is where his movement stopped. Like he couldn't move as easily anymore. Dracula, the book, is an epistolary, which means that it is written instead of in normal chaptered prose form, it is written in letter form. Epistolary literally means letter writing, right? So like it's a letter. An epistle is a letter. So so the book Dracula is written with like newspaper cuttings and diary entries and letters written to and from people, and that changes the way you would read the text. Because it makes it seem more realistic than it actually is, just because you feel like you're reading private missives, like private letters from between people.
Well, I think it's brilliant, the the background that you kind of lay of Bram Stoker and the context. I was particularly interested in the context of the publication of the text, and in one of the chapters, actually, Van Helsing says about the nature of the time where this book is set. He talks about the 19th century, right? The skepticism and the importance and the relevance that is given to scientific thought and scientific thinking, and how that influences the text itself, but also previous texts, like you mentioned, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, almost 70 years before Dracula was published. But in also in looking at that, I think we come to the first part of our discussion that I would like us to go into, which is sci-fi as a genre of literature, how that works, and how powerful science fiction is, how it drives innovation in the sciences, but also how it explains how humans interact with the scientific advancements of their time. Particularly here, I'm thinking of what Van Helsing says somewhere in chapter 14, where he's talking about the nature of how science works. He says, "It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explains not, then it says there is nothing to explain." If science cannot explain some things, then these are supernatural things. They are beyond the nature that science seeks to investigate. And it's brilliant because, and I think Brendan, when he was here for the first episode when we were talking about Things Fall Apart, he says, well, one of the things that literature does very well, and this came off a question that somebody asks about, well, they find historical fiction more believable, more enjoying, more engaging than actual history. And when you bring fiction into anything, so forget historical fiction, now think about science fiction, right? Sci-fi. When you bring fiction into science, it also does that for science. It makes science more fun. It makes science more enjoyable. And I think that's the power of literature, right? It brings science and makes it more fun, more engaging, as I said, that we have so many adaptations of this particular novel. We have characters that are formed from this, festivals that are formed from this, people identifying in groups that they link to Dracula, the undead, and so on. Really, so it's the power of literature to make a subject that is that would perhaps only be studied as within a particular field, to make it popular culture as Dracula has become today, or the vampire has become today. But talk to me actually about the science fiction nature of it. And you did kind of started on this, but just more on the coming together of science and fiction and literature and how that kind of works in this novel.
Yeah, because this time period, like the Victorian age, like the 19th century, is when the Western world was being enlightened, if you will, in the sciences. It's when they started actually like treating science as separate from religion, which is an interesting distinction because in the Islamic world that didn't happen. So in the Caliphate and things like that, and in the Ottoman Empire, science and religion were not divorced from each other. However, in Victorian England, they definitely were, and indeed in what they call the continent, so France, Spain, Italy, where they're and Germany, obviously, where these these Renaissance movements were happening and things like that. They definitely believed that science was separate from religion. Perhaps not initially, but definitely by the end of the 19th century, you wouldn't even think to put those two in the same category. You could, and that's probably why today we have Christian fundamentalists that don't believe in evolution. Like it's that sort of divide, whereas Darwin was a Christian, so he didn't really feel like as if it was like, oh, I'm writing something against God. However, by the time it got to the church, it was like, no, you either believe in evolution or you believe in God. And that's where, the schism, or, you can really see that that was what was happening in this time period. And I think between Frankenstein and Dracula, you have a different way of looking at science. So in Frankenstein, there's more like, science is almost, not quite, but almost monstrous in that it can go too far. So for Frankenstein, it was, for those who don't know what Frankenstein, the book's premise is, Frankenstein is the doctor. So Dr. Frankenstein basically pieces together different body parts from the morgue and things and tries to create a living being, and that is Frankenstein's monster, the thing that in popular culture we're calling Frankenstein. So in Mary Shelley's work, you have this idea that science can go so far that it can create life without, any of the things that normally make life, like procreation, for example. IVF wasn't really a thing at the time, but that kind of thing. So, whereas by the time you get to Dracula, that's not quite what the engagement with science is. Science exists, however, Stoker seems to be saying that, mythology has its own place when science fails. So we've moved on from science can go too far to literally do everything to science can do a lot of things, but it can't do everything. And this is where tradition falls in line. So I agree with you. I agree with Dico in that, there's like this sense in what Van Helsing says that, that the ancient scriptures still do talk about this stuff. This stuff still exists. And this might not have a scientific basis, but it's definitely real. I mean, Renfield is a brilliant example of this as a character. He's called a zoophagus, phagus meaning eating, zoo meaning animal. So he was just ingesting animals. But at one point when he presumably has met Dracula, they say that, oh, he has religious mania as well. As though that's a disorder, that kind of thing. As though it's a disorder that is only in his head. It can't possibly be real. But it's interesting because that's in a sanatorium. They're talking about this religious mania, like as if, like, oh, he thinks that he can see God or something. But all the characters in our story are religious. So Dr. Seward is a Christian, right? He's a practicing science man, but he is also religious. So when he's describing that Renfield has this religious mania, he says, which is ridiculous, obviously, because why would God talk to him like that? Like, God wouldn't do that. So it's not that he's saying that God doesn't exist. He's saying that, well, God wouldn't do this, right? That doesn't make sense. So like there's a distance between science and religion, but even in science, it is a religious mind that is going into it. So to divorce the two things was difficult for people at the time as well, because they were religious, but they grew up in a world which was more and more trying to base everything in a scientific approach, and a scientific approach just means using observation as the crux for belief. And for a lot of metaphysical things and spiritual things, there is no actual seeing is believing. Like that doesn't exist. So for them, that seems to be a sticking point, which isn't necessarily always true.
Yeah, just while you say that, actually, I was thinking about one of the quotes. If you can access some of the quotes we have,
Yeah.
there's the last one on the list that Van Helsing is explaining to them, before they decide on a course of action, what they're going to do to attack Dracula and get rid of Dracula.
All we have to go upon are traditions and superstitions. These do not at the first appear much when the matter is one of life and death, nay, of more than either life or death. Yet must we be satisfied in the first place because we have to be. No other means is at our control. And secondly, because after all these things, tradition and superstition are everything. Does not the belief in vampires rest for others, though not, alas, for us on them? A year ago, which of us would have received such a possibility in the midst of our scientific, skeptical, matter of fact 19th century? We even scouted a belief that we saw justified under our very eyes. Take it then that the vampire and the belief in his limitations and his cure rest for the moment on the same base.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, that's the flavor of what we've been talking about, right? Like they because what literature does in this point is it creates a situation where the existence of vampires is a factual matter, right? Because what
Yes.
Stoker does with his text is, and this is what literature does with almost anything you can think of that is fantasy based, where in the real world, or what we call the real world, we would look at and or when we hear about it, we would not believe it. If you tell me that people can fly, I would tell you, no, they cannot. But if in a book somebody flies and other people are there to see them fly, then it is possible because it has happened in that reality of the text that you're reading. And Aisha talked about this in the very first episode when we started. She talked about the suspension of disbelief, which is fundamental in our appreciation of fiction, because we have to suspend disbelief at a certain level, and then we can enjoy the fiction more more readily and without much resistance. And this particular excerpt that Aisha read is exactly that. It is creating a reality, even though it is against the ways of the 19th century, as Van Helsing says. But they all now have to suspend that disbelief that they have. He's kind of introducing them into the new reality that they're faced with. And the other quote that you started reading, Aisha, which is saying for us,
Right.
because it leads us beautifully into the next thing we want to talk about.
Yeah. He says, Professor said, I may, I suppose, take it that we are all acquainted with the facts that are in these papers. There are such beings as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist. Even had we not the proof of our own unhappy experience, the teachings and the records of the past give proof enough for sane peoples. I admit that at the first I was skeptic. Were it not that through long years I have trained myself to keep an open mind, I could not have believed until such time as that fact under thunder on my ear.
Yeah, so on this point, actually, I wanted us to look at the way the story is told, right? Because this quote that Aisha reads out is just Van Helsing basically saying that all the stories that because up until this point they've been writing in their journals or they've been writing their correspondence until Mina Harker decides to read all of Lucy's letters to her, and then kind of looks at also she shares her own letters with Van Helsing, and then they look at Dr. Seward's diaries and his recording of his patient and his nature, the nature of his pathology. So they bring all these different bits and pieces and the cuttings from the newspaper. They bring all these different pieces, and now they understand everything that everyone else in the story knew at a particular point in time, because they didn't all know everything else about everyone else. But the beauty of this text and how it's brought together is that we get multiple perspectives, right? It's told from different sources. And all these are brought together, and at a point, Van Helsing declares, okay, we have the facts before us. These are the facts. Now, these have become factual within that story because these are the experiences that they all have. And Van Helsing says as much as some of the quotes that we've read will say, will tell, right? So Aisha, I just wanted you to kind of, I wanted you to kind of talk us through the nature of the narration, how unique this is in prose, whether it is common or it is not, or if you've come across it yourself in some of your other readings of other works of prose fiction. How does this kind of compare to what a standard novel would perhaps be written in?
Hmm. Well, a standard novel is a bit of a misnomer because there's no such thing as a standard novel. Um, Different genres have different writing styles, and that's true. But but I suppose what we consider standard novel is novel has a beginning, novel has an end. It's usually following the same character. If there's ever multiple perspectives in a novel, they usually don't tend to be more than one or two. Like, like it's usually one or two extra apart from the actual main narrative. Um, you know, as I'm sure all of us are aware of, most novels tend to be either in third person perspective or in first person perspective. There's also third person focalized. So third person omniscient, which is, like it was a bright and sunny morning and the trees were fluttering and I don't know, Mrs. Doubtfire had worn another wig, that kind of thing.
I'll give you another one, Aisha. Okonkwo was well known throughout the 9 villages and even beyond.
Yes, you're right. That is third person
Just a
omniscient.
voice from out of nowhere telling you about some guy Okonkwo.
Exactly. Omniscient meaning all knowing. Then third person focalized would be something like the Harry Potter books. You know, it's like, Harry didn't think this was happening, but he supposed that, so everything we know about the world is through Harry. If Harry didn't see it happening, we don't know about it. And that's third person focalized. So Dracula then in that sense is different. Um, not and I think the reason why it can manage to handle so many different narrative perspectives is because of the genre, which is epistolary. It would be a lot harder, I think, to do these many narratives with with a standard prose point of view, first, like how you would write that, like a narrative voice. With epistolary, you don't need to know their backstory. You don't need to know, what how they relate to people. The author doesn't need to establish that because by virtue of having written a letter to another person, they clearly are close enough for that. You don't have to establish that relationship. This relationship is established just in the fact that this letter was written.
You're right. That's very interesting. Actually, I didn't think of that till you just mentioned it. You never find, and what novels do. This is what prose does. You usually find a kind of knitting together of the characters. When we read Things Fall Apart, when we read it in episode 1, we were talking about how the story kind of goes back to tell us the backstory of Unoka from when he was a child to what he was like as a child, and then as he is, Unoka, the grown up, and how he's a debtor and how he's this, how he's that, and how that is something that Okonkwo now grows up to dislike. But we don't see that with the characters in Dracula because they the only thing we know about them is what they say through their correspondence and through their diaries. So of course they're not going to go into detail about, oh, of course I was a child, when I was a child, this is what I did, this is what I. They might do that in their diary, but you would probably not find it in a. It would be very rare to find that. So it's interesting that that level of backstory is actually not available in an epistolary novel. And what this book uniquely does, I think, is it does knit together so many different characters and brings their personal voices. And this is one of the questions I had for you also, is how much does Stoker succeed in creating personalized styles of talking? Speech. The speech of Dr. Van Helsing is different from the speech of Dracula and different from the speech of Nina and Jonathan. And even within their diaries, it's strange, I think, in a way, and this is perhaps a hole to poke at the way the writing is, that when Nina writes something that someone else says in the group when they're discussing, she uses the exact voice that they would have So you look at the structure of the sentence of Van Helsing, you find that there are certain places that he might not have subject verb agreement because he's not a natural, native speaker of English, right? And so you do find the different personalities and the ways that they speak, but you almost know, I suppose, if you look at it very forensically, you can tell that Stoker is extending his ability to capture the speech of different characters to the characters themselves. So, like, why is it that in Nina Harker's journal, you're seeing Van Helsing speak exactly as Leo, right? Exactly what he says in verbatim.
It's interesting that you mentioned this. But yeah, you can continue, but yeah.
No, carry on, please.
Okay, so it's interesting that you mentioned that because Mina Harker is the only one that writes characters' accents in her own entries. So the like the old man at the pier and things like that, she actually writes exactly how he speaks, and I think this is.
But doesn't Dr. Seward do that as well in his own?
When he's writing about Renfield, right? And when he's describing Van Helsing's speech as well.
Yeah.
Yes, he also does that. So it's Mina Harker and him that do that. However, the reason why this would not why I think this works within the realm of suspension of disbelief is because initially in the first few chapters, Jonathan says, I don't know if I can actually describe exactly what I heard from these people. I know there are people who can do that, they have the ability to do that, but I don't. So I'm going to try my level best to record as much as I can remember. He fully admits that this is something that he's not capable of doing. He also
this is Nina, actually, not Jonathan. Nina's talking about journalists, how she has heard that some journalists are able to recall an entire interview. So she says she's gonna try and do that in her journal. Yeah. I think, but you might be right. It might be Jonathan also, but I think it's one of the two.
Okay. No. It is Mina that says that. Oh, for like they can record exactly what they hear, like in the whole span of a day and stuff. But it is Jonathan that first mentions that I can't write exactly what Dracula said to me. I can't I can't write exactly it, but I will try my best to get the sense of it. So he acknowledges that this is not something everybody can do, and therefore the text acknowledges that it is not something everybody can do. I think
in that sense also, sorry to cut in, but I think in that sense also, they are consciously trying to replicate the exact way that the different characters speak within their journals, within their accounts of what has happened, right? So that would make sense of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And they're all so with Jonathan, if you really wanted to find the reason why they're writing like this, with Mina it's because she's trying to practice, but with Jonathan it's not Jonathan, it's with Dr. Seward, it's because he's a psychiatrist. He naturally has to write this stuff down.
He has a case study. Even in psychoanalysis, it's a whole thing where you have a case study, you write the whole case. And so you have to remember as much as you can from your interview with your patients. So, you know what, it totally makes sense. For the simple reason of journalistic integrity, Mina Harker would want to remember everything. For Dr. Seward's profession as a therapist or psychiatrist, he has to remember his conversations with his patients. So he does that in verbatim too. So I think there might be a deeper reason to why these people are the way they are and why it's cut so brilliantly exactly as it should be.
But obviously the real reason is because you can't keep writing in indirect speech. You could, a lot of epistolaries do that, but then it would genuinely just read like, I don't think this is a perfect example of an epistolary because of the direct quotes. Because of the direct quotes, it's fictional. It's not, because usually epistolaries aren't fictional. They're usually compilations of letters that people have actually written. So I think that's an interesting distinction to have made, that he uses direct quotes rather than indirect. Because you could have 100% just used indirect quotes, and then he wouldn't have even had to do the accent thing. He wouldn't have had to do that. He wouldn't have had to have Van Helsing have weird diction or miss out words and things like that. He wouldn't need to. He could have he could have just used indirect speech for all of this. And a lot of authors do that, especially when they're trying to describe things that are in a letter. And usually in letters, you don't use direct quotes when you're saying like, and this is what this guy said, quote, quote. No, you say, I can't believe this guy said this. Like, you know.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. I think you're right. I think you're right. But I think that's also on the other question I wanted to ask you, like how much does he succeed in doing what he does? You know, is it believable in a sense what he does? The characters themselves.
Yeah. I think he spends a good half of the novel, like so about 150 pages before Lucy dies and is undead. So there are at the very beginning you have a lot of description. I think it's really interesting that we began with Jonathan because Jonathan spends a lot of time describing his surroundings, describing things. But even in his descriptions, he uses words like, oh, and this was a gloomy looking mountain, or very, he uses pathos words for descriptions of landscapes. He uses emotive words, and that almost immediately, because it's a description of landscape, it's factual. But because he slowly uses, like, he's using adjectives that are not factual to describe a factual thing, you're like the reader is slowly immersed into a world where like you sort of slowly start seeing the mountains as being dark and sinister, or the wolves as being dangerous, but also listening to this man. So you are very slowly but gently introduced into this world of magic and mythology. But Jonathan is not a man of mythology. He's a man of law, right? And he doesn't ever write like as if he genuinely believes there's something actually weird going on. He keeps saying that, oh, I think I'm going insane, or I'm writing this down exactly as it is because I'm not sure that um if I look, I'm not sure that what I'm seeing is real, so I'm going to write this down so that I can look back on it and try to piece together what on earth is happening with me. So like the reader doesn't have to immediately start believing in the undead and vampires just walking around, roaming around, and preying on innocent virgins. You, from the very beginning, you have this sense of this is the real world, but hang on, why is this so weird? Why was this always in the background? And we only care about it because now our characters are involved in it, and in the same way that they are first introduced to. So we're not coming from the perspective of a character that already exists in this fantasy realm. We're coming from a character that's outside it, that now has an encounter with it. And so I think that, yeah, so this and then so by the time we get to halfway through the novel and Van Helsing is stuffing garlic in the windows, we're not, we're just like, oh yeah, we know why he's doing that. Dr. Seward doesn't, but we know why he's doing this. um but see, what has happened there is that because we know that garlic is something that wards off vampires, and we know this from the characters in in that town that Jonathan was at, where they also had the smell of garlic coming out and things like that. That's how we know that this is working. That's why Van Helsing is doing this. That's why he's working to get rid of the vampiric element. We understand that. Um, but that's completely supernatural. That's not factual information. However, because of the way it was introduced to us, and because the character we're seeing it through is unaware of something that we are aware of, which is the brilliant thing about multiple perspectives, is 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 that we feel like because we are in the know, that this must be true because we know something that the character doesn't know, and then it becomes reality. So fiction becomes reality because it is knowledge. It becomes assumed knowledge, even within the text. And I think that that's like it's a really intricate but almost easy to overlook thing that the text does, is make us feel like we are the same people for seeing for putting together the things before the characters figure it out.
The text is an epistolary novel, as we've discussed. It does mean that you have letters and you have diary entries. Now, diary entries and letters are particularly intimate means of conveying one's thoughts or your feelings, or how you wish to even talk to other people, because you're talking to somebody either who you know very well, or, you know, depending on what the relationship is. Now, Mina Harker and Lucy are like best friends, right? And Mina is also Jonathan's wife, but in general, how did you find the way that the women spoke in the text? Now, we have to, of course, keep in mind the time when this book is set. Also, the fact that it is very much a religious text. But how did you find the characters of the women in the text, given that Bram Stoker is a man, of course, a man of his time?
Yeah, nothing I read made me feel like this was unnatural or that I wasn't reading a woman's perspective. Virginia Woolf talks about an androgynous mind, how she can, like, there are some texts that she finds really easy to read. And there are some texts that she can't read at all because she feels like it wasn't made for her brain. And those are for her texts that she can't access at all. And so she says the kind of brain that an author requires is an androgynous one, where they are neither masculine nor feminine, but are open to both because both can be read. And in that sense, I think this text definitely fits her requirements. It definitely meets
Yeah.
her requirements of a text that, you know, doesn't feel like you can't read it just because you are a woman, just because it's written by a man. Because there are some texts like that, which aren't written these days, really, like necessarily. You just don't write them like that anymore because there are, you know, you can't be a reader and not read a book written by a woman anymore. Whereas once upon a time, you could conceivably go your whole life without having read a single thing written by a woman, because there were very few women that wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, they wrote and then they wrote under a masculine pen name. So you had no idea if you were reading a woman's work. But yeah, it was definitely less than it is today. Like, you know, so the idea of not being able of writing a woman as a man, and not doing it right is still a thing today. Definitely, you only have to look at about most of any film that has ever been written about women. um but but then the but then you have an understanding of what a woman's voice is from this text. I obviously, Lucy is incredibly sweet, and, you know, uh, too sweet even, and she's really innocent and, you know, fluttery and beautiful and bursts into tears and things like that. But there's nothing wrong with anything that she's done. Like, it's definitely in keeping with with a girl, because that is what she is. She's a girl, right? And it's definitely in keeping with how she would be like that. And Mina Harker is described as having a masculine mind or whatever by one of the
Yeah, there's a
characters.
quote. There's a quote there. If you would like to read it, it's somewhere in the quotes that I think we talked about earlier.
He says, "Ah, that wonderful Madam Mina. She has man's brain, a brain that a man should have, were he much gifted, and a woman's heart. We men are determined, nay, are we not, pledged to destroy this monster? But it is no part for a woman. Even if she be not harmed, her heart may fail her in so much, in so many horrors, and hereafter she may suffer, both in waking and from her nerves, and in sleep from her dreams." So, yeah. So he said that she has a man's brain, but a woman's heart. And well, that's an interesting way just to say that she's a rational person, but also she's emotional.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's a one-liner. She has a man's brain, but he adds that if the man were to be much gifted, of course.
Yeah.
So even in men, to have a mind like he would compare to Mina's mind, the person has to be very much gifted, so
Yeah.
as presumably very intelligent, right? Because she is the one who suggests that they compile all that they have from the different pieces of writing that they have from their diaries and their accounts that they have recorded, to put them together and have a single copy of the whole story so far. And we as the readers, we kind of have the comfort of sitting back and going, well, I know all this, so let me just let them read and catch up with where I am. So in a very intelligent way, I think what Mina does in this text is that she demonstrates how, there is so much to be said for being able, I suppose, to reflect and not just rush into action, which some of the men would have probably, like suggested in the text. But the one thing of her being emotional, I think, before we see Mina being so emotional or Van Helsing, like expressing his concerns that she might be disturbed, we actually see this in Jonathan himself, because Jonathan, having gone through what he went through at Castle Dracula, he has dreams, nightmares, exactly what Van Helsing is describing, actually, that this might be what Mina has to go through, is exactly what Jonathan goes through in the text, because, he no longer has, peaceful sleep. He's, even in daytime, when he sees Dracula for the first time in London, in England, he's like shocked, and he had to take a nap, and he was napping on Mina's shoulder. So it's like, there's also another quote from the quotes that I sent you where Mina is kind of saying, we women, she's describing women, have something of the mother in us, right?
Yes.
If you can actually read that, I think it's a very brilliant quote that today would probably be scoffed at, because it doesn't work in the way that we like to look at the different genders that we have, or gender roles, the way that we would assign gender roles today. This quote might not be so helpful, but in the text, or at least at the time, this is something that is considered. And what you said, you found it believable, because I think I also did. I didn't have qualms with anything that was said. Of course, there were some things that were said that I would cringe at and go, like, that Madam Mina has a man's brain. I was like, oh, okay, she has a man's brain. But yeah,
you
it
could
was
hear
in its
somebody
time.
today having said that.
Yeah,
you could definitely hear somebody today saying that. Like, it's not
absolutely, absolutely.
it's not.
It's not
We haven't
entirely,
evolved.
it's not entirely devolved from reality or what we would expect from reality today. So yeah, it does make sense in that sense. But yeah, go ahead. The quote of "we women," because it was one of the things that I thought was, just interesting to read while I was reading the text.
So in chapter 17, Mina Harker says, we women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters when the mother spirit is invoked. I felt this big, sorrowing man's head resting on me, as though it were that of a baby that some day may lie on my bosom, and I stroked his hair as though he were my own child.
Yeah. So this is her talking
Mhm.
about Lord Godalming,
Arthur.
her kind of comforting him, Arthur, comforting him, of the loss of his wife, because up until that point, Arthur actually didn't have an opportunity to grieve as a normal human being should grieve, because of the expectation that he's a man, and apparently he should not grieve at all. and she's the one who kind of invites him to let off the steam, right? Like, what happened to you is terrible, Arthur. Just let it out, let it go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because like the woman is the caring, the caring home. Like, so it's like you can rest here. It's like she's created a space for him to allow himself to be vulnerable, which is just it's a thing that we're tackling today in society, where women are allowed to cry at anything and are vilified for it, but also like, yeah, they can cry at anything, but a man is not allowed to cry at things. It's not really a thing. You're not allowed to do this thing. It's definitely more I think in the Western idea of what a man is, definitely far more than I think it is in the Eastern, at least in the texts that I've read. Like, so the Asian texts that I've read, they tend to have like, a man can have irrational emotions because he's allowed to have that. It's not like a remarked upon thing. It just is. It just exists. Even in Greek literature, you have Achilles crying and mourning and angry. Like, you know, the whole text begins because Achilles is childishly angry. You know, this emotional reticence, however, this idea that not to express emotions is to be rational, that's definitely a thing and a quality that evolved during the 19th century in Western literature and Western discourse. The idea that rational and irrational are binary. And so the irrational is the woman and the rational is the man. So this schism between things that used to just be for everybody. Everybody could have very calm and logical manners, but also, you know, be irrational when they're grieving or angry or sad or excessively happy even. Like that sort of thing became two separate things. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is another, you know, great example of a sci-fi thing during this time period as well. It's also 19th century. It's also Gothic. It's also sci-fi, but but Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is about this man that has separated his rational from his irrational side. So Dr. Jekyll is the rational and Mr. Hyde is the irrational. But an argument can be made that the fact that he even split himself up like this is the need to be irrational and the fact that he used to be both at the same time, you know, but he had to split it off. It's definitely a flavor of this time period, this idea that you need to split these things, that you can't be irrational if you live in a rational society, so you cannot be emotional, which for some reason they categorized as, you know, actually showing emotion as being an irrational thing. So yeah, so that became the domain of the woman. And I think a large part of why I think Dracula is not something that you would read today and feel like this is like a bit too much, is because you still have that allowance of a woman's sphere, I suppose, which they've created to affect the man's sphere as well. So a man can cry, albeit in the presence of a woman, but a man can cry. Like, so, whereas there are texts that are just like, the man never cries. It's like as if he doesn't feel any emotion at all anyway. Like, that just never happened. Who are you talking to? So, you know, but that's why I think Dracula works even right now. Like, it's not, yeah, there's an element of like the weird misogyny that cropped up in this century in English literature. But yeah, yes.
And I suppose also the idea of chivalry kind of comes into it, because the idea of the gentleman has to be the one to look out for the woman at all times. I don't know how much that also plays into this, but yeah, enough said about this.
So
Finally,
sorry.
I was
Yeah, but yeah, just before we move on, the chivalry thing. Chivalry is like, you know, we're thinking Arthurian legends, you know, knights in shining armor, that sort of thing. Even the concept of chivalry, if you read C.S. Lewis's article on it, the idea that a man can feel really strong emotions and express them is a part of chivalry. So it is not removed from chivalry. They being emotional is just a part, like it's not removed from the idea of the perfect knight. Whereas in the 19th century, being a perfect gentleman means you cannot be irrational, like, you know, cannot show heightened emotions. So this is definitely a thing that has changed. This is a change for their time period, for the time that Bram Stoker was writing Dracula. This is when this idea of the rational man became a thing, like became an actual
and
thing.
and yeah, I think we can also almost record it in real time as we read the text. We can see the change occurring, you know, in the characters. You can see that kind of changing to what you're describing there, you know, being, you know, kind of reverting back to the natural state of expressing emotions, crying, for goodness sake. If it pains that much, please cry about it. There's nothing wrong about it. And when Arthur leaves, Quincy Morris also comes and, you know, he totally cries also, which is just, and I think that was part of the most powerful part of this text, where you see these men becoming human in a text that is about the undead, about the inhuman. But that just, makes you just admire this text all the more. Yeah. So finally, I don't know how much. This is going to give me so much work to do for editing, but that's totally fine. What did you make of the plot? Basically, the storyline. Is it
I think,
aligned?
yeah, you're right. I think there was only one instance of any backtracking in terms of chronology, but otherwise it's a fairly linear text. It's only when we switch from Jonathan's to Mina's perspective that we actually have any, non-chronology, the backtracking, if you will. But that's because I think the reason why that happens is because the author, at least for a large amount of time, wants us to believe that Jonathan is dead. So we have to backtrack to see how he knows all these things. But you're right. So the text begins in medias res, which means that it begins in the middle of a scene, because it isn't until well later that we understand why Jonathan's even going to visit Count Dracula, why he's even here. Because initially, if you just read the first chapter, you're kind of like, oh, these two must know each other. Like, he's going there to meet him for a personal reason, clearly. And then we find out that he doesn't even know this guy. He's never met him before. Like, what? But yeah. And all the foreboding elements are all there now. But yeah, so that's it starts off as horror basically from that
But
point.
because of the nature of the text, there's a part where we just get cut, right? We just get a cutting from a newspaper clipping, and it is kind of explaining how Dracula comes to England on a ship, the whole story behind it, basically, which is not timed in the text. In the text, it doesn't have a time when it occurs, because it kind of rips you away from all the action that is happening and kind of tells you, okay, this is how Dracula comes into England. Because in Mina Harker's journals, we learn how Lucy is bitten by Count Dracula on the bench in the park or wherever it was. But the point is that we don't actually get to know how he comes to England until further into the story. I'll tell you, when I started reading this text, again, this time for this session that we're having now, I started from chapter 1 and then I jumped to chapter 11. Do you know how that happened? But I kept reading because I thought it was normal, because of the nature of the text, because you'd have to go from one journal to another person's journal. I thought it was natural. That was how it's supposed to be. So I went from chapter 1 to chapter 11, 12, 13. I didn't know I was doing that until I was, I think, in chapter 12 or 13. I was, hang on a minute, where's Mina? Because something's happening here. But I'll leave you to it. Can you guess how I did that jump? Because I didn't know I had done it. Can you guess a reason why that was? Think about how I read. Think about how I read normally.
Oh, audiobooks, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Just skip to
no,
it.
because one, the next thing after 1 is normally, sorry, I went from 1 to 10, then 11 and 12. So it went 1 and then skipped to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It was supposed to be 1, and then I would go to chapter 2 because it was after 20, and then you have chapter 2, and then chapter 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so it kind of, it kind of broke. So when I read chapter 1, it went to chapter 10 because 10 is the next number that also has a 1 on it. So it went 10, 11, 12. Yeah. So I had to just cut it short and go, wait, because I wasn't looking at what I was listening to. But then when I found out, I was like, hang on a minute, what's this nonsense? Bring back Mina. I need to hear from you. Yeah, but yeah, so that's the nature of the story. Like, even if you kind of do a leap at some point, somehow it does tend to make sense because of the way the story is told in different accounts. That's why, to me, you did say it's a bit conventional, a bit linear in that sense. I think for me, reading it in that way, it does feel like sometimes it can be like abrupt, the break from the narration. So even where you're placed in an entirely different part of the text, it kind of might still make some sense. Although I have read it before, so that might be the reason why I also picked up.
I've never read Dracula before, but just because you know, I live in this century. We have enough, kind of like, like a vague understanding of what might have happened in Dracula. I mean, I didn't know the whole who Mina Harker was, who Lucy Westenra was. I didn't know their names, which is bizarre. Because I never watched the actual Dracula movies. They do exist in those texts, albeit in different versions of themselves, and the story is different in the movies. But yeah, but you know that Dracula lives in Transylvania, and then he moves to the lovely fogs of London, and then he yeets back after Van Helsing does some magic doctor powers. I don't know, but like that was the rough outline I had in my head. Like, like Dracula moves to London after having lived in Transylvania for eons, comes and tries to like turn a woman into a vampire, and then Van Helsing kills him. That's that was my thing. That was my rough outline. But in that sense, I think maybe it's just because I like reading mystery novels so much, and I also read a lot of epistolary for some reason, even though I don't like the genre. I've read enough epistolary that I suppose for someone who hasn't read a lot of epistolary, yes, every diary entry, every new like newspaper clipping and that kind of thing, it would seem abrupt. And then in that sense, you could start from chapter 1 and instead of going to chapter 2, go to chapter 10, but still feel like as if this is just how the text is written. And yeah, the starts and the stops and things like that, that's something that you get used to as time goes on, and that's how epistolary is, again, another way how it's different from normal prose, where there's like, there's segues, there are narrative segues to get from one point of the text to the next. And it's so natural that if you didn't have that, you would feel like there's some, there's an abrupt, like a rupture here, or this guy clearly doesn't know how to write. Like, why is he writing like this? Which you don't get in epistolary, because there is no segue. There is no need to have like, like, okay, and then this is the transition from this scene to this scene. No, you can just move on. You don't need to do that, because you can just switch to different characters writing, or you can just say that, oh yeah, she didn't write a letter for maybe 6 months, but then she's back, guys. This is what she's writing now. So yeah, the epistolary form, the genre definitely lends to that. I think you could conceivably have skipped like, a good meat of the text, and then yeah, but I do think it is in chronological order, except when we go back to what was going on in England from Mina's perspective as opposed to Jonathan's. But yeah. So
And also, when we go back to how Dracula arrives in England, it is also almost like a flashback in that sense, right?
um yeah, yes. So some of those things are
Did you?
definitely like, yeah.
Yeah,
What?
like the cutting. There was like a cutting where the Pall Gazette reports the arrival of a ship where all you can see is the captain, right? His hands tied to the
Yeah.
steering wheel and all that stuff. So that kind of, it's almost another episode entirely, a different episode that you go like, how is this related to the text? But the moment you realize there's something supernatural in the voyage of the ship, you go, oh, Dracula must have been on that ship. That must be how he got on there. So it just leads you to have been the arrival of Dracula. And other stories also that talk about the wolf, that the guy had the wolf, and then the wolf kind of
Yeah, the wolf went missing, and then it's
went
later
away.
on that we find out that Lucy was attacked by the wolf. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is, I suppose, like, a little bit hop, skip, and jumping, just to,
Exactly.
because different people have different different people are going to be writing at different times about the same event, or going to find out about the same event at different times. So in that sense, yes, but the chronology, I don't think, is at fault. I think the chronology is, that's what I'm looking for. It is linear in the sense that one thing happens after another. It's just that when the characters are talking about it, they're not happening at the same time.
Mm.
So I think in
Well,
that,
that's very good.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So like, if Mina wrote a letter and then Lucy wrote a letter, Lucy clearly wrote that letter after Mina wrote a letter, but Lucy could be talking about something from pre Mina's letter in her like that could be happening.
Now, lastly, is this your favorite text? Because I can clearly see that you enjoy this text so much. It must be your favorite book of all time ever written by any human being or supernatural being or Dracula or anyone else. Yeah, this must be the it text for you. So just go on, start recommending it to everyone. This is your favorite text. And we can call it.
It is definitely. It's definitely a good text. I enjoyed reading it far more than I did enjoy reading the other ones for the plot, I mean. Because in terms of lyricality, the others were definitely more up there. But this one was a lot more fun to read. It was more, this felt more fiction, which is a really weird thing to say, but it felt more like a piece of fictional work. It's also the genre I prefer reading anyway, fantasy. I prefer reading fantasy anyway. And also it was nice to see all the different hints of, like, what I've seen in pop culture, like, finally making sense because it's happened before all the pop culture stuff happened. And it was nice, like the people's names and things as well was quite fun. Because like his name is Jonathan Harker, right? And a harker, like, so he's harking the beginning of the text, he's harking the arrival of Dracula to London, that kind of thing. That's okay, that's a nice last name.
Next time we'll be reading 2 short stories. We'll be reading A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, and we'll also be reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart.
All right, yeah, so next week we're doing 2 short stories, and we hope you see them.
Thank you very much for joining us for this episode. This episode is brought to you by Soundbound Media, and this is Kasupod Project.